Open a medicine cabinet in an average American home in 1932. Not the bathroom, the kitchen, because in 1932, the medicine was kept where the knowledge was. What you find? A tin of mustard powder, a brown glass bottle of camphorated oil, tincture of iodine, dark as tea, a paper packet of boric acid, castor oil, a small bottle of turpentine, cloves, a jar of lard that serves at least 3 medical purposes, depending on the season. Nothing in that cabinet has a brand name you would recognize today. Nothing requires a prescription. Everything requires knowledge, the knowledge of what to do with it, how much, when, and for how long. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next without being written down anywhere that anyone thought to preserve. Now open the medicine cabinet in the same house today. Same cabinet, different country. What emptied it was not simply better science, it was money and regulation and the slow, systematic transfer of medical authority from the household to the institution. A transfer that took about 50 years, happened largely without public debate, and was complete before most Americans noticed it had begun. Some of what left deserved to go. Some of it was never formally evaluated before it was gone. And one of the things that left came back, 60 years later, approved by the FDA, doing exactly what it had always done. Here is what was in that cabinet, what replaced it, and what the replacement actually cost. Mustard plasters. The mustard plaster was not folk medicine in any dismissive sense of the term. It was applied medicine, skilled, specific, and documented in nursing manuals and household guides well into the 1940s. The preparation was straightforward. Dry mustard powder combined with flour, typically 1 part mustard to 4 parts flour for adults, more diluted for children, mixed with warm water or egg white into a paste, spread onto cloth, and applied to the chest. The active mechanism was understood at the time. Mustard oil causes hyperemia, increased blood flow to the surface tissue, which produced warmth and relief in respiratory congestion. The redness it left on the skin was not incidental, it was the point. What replaced it was introduced in 1905. Vicks VapoRub didn't improve on the mustard plaster, it packaged it, a pre-mixed, commercially prepared chest remedy that required no knowledge, no preparation, no judgment about concentration or timing. The first major commercial chest product did not defeat the home remedy on pharmacological grounds. It defeated it on convenience and on the cultural authority of a product with a label over a practice with a recipe. That distinction between the remedy replaced by something better and the remedy replaced by something easier runs through almost everything that follows.
2. Castor oil. Castor oil was the great democratic remedy of American domestic medicine. It crossed every line: regional, economic, ethnic, generational. The grandmother who kept a tin of lard for chest rubs might disagree with her neighbor about nearly everything. She agreed about castor oil. Extracted from the seeds of Ricinus communis, it had been documented as a household purgative from the colonial period through the mid-20th century. It was administered routinely to children for constipation, for sluggishness, for the seasonal cleansing that many households treated as basic maintenance. Children who grew up in the 1930s and 1940s describe the experience with a consistency that suggests genuine cultural universality. The commercial alternatives arrived early: X-Lax in 1906, Phillips' Milk of Magnesia from the 1880s onward. But castor oil held on for decades alongside them because it worked, and because it cost almost nothing, and because the knowledge of how to use it required no instruction from anyone with a medical degree. What finally displaced it was not a study demonstrating its inferiority. It was the post-war commercial pharmacy boom, the proliferation of products that cost a little more, tasted considerably better, and carried the word modern in their marketing as a replacement for the word effective. The advantage of X-Lax over castor oil was not pharmacological, It was cultural. By the mid-1960s, that was enough. Worth noting, the same castor oil being administered to children at home was being used as a lubricant in aircraft engines during World War II. Both uses confirmed. Same product, same tin. 3. Cod liver oil. Rickets was real. That point matters before anything else. In the industrial cities of early 20th century America, dense, smoky, full of children who worked indoors or played in streets that saw little direct sunlight, vitamin D deficiency was a documented public health problem. Bone deformities in children, delayed development, concentrated in low-income communities where nutrition was already stressed and sun exposure was limited. Not a minor condition, a visible, measurable consequence of how industrial America had arranged itself. Cod liver oil was the intervention, thick, pungent, administered by the spoonful to protesting children across the country. It worked, not because anyone fully understood why until Elmer McCollum and his colleagues identified vitamin D in 1922, but because the empirical record of generations said that it did. When the science caught up with the practice, it confirmed what the practice already knew. The displacement of cod liver oil didn't come from a competitor. It came from upstream. Beginning in the early 1930s, commercial dairies began fortifying fluid milk with vitamin D. By 1945, the majority of commercially sold milk in the United States carried the fortification. Rickets rates dropped sharply. The need for cod liver oil, the specific need it had been meeting, was engineered out of the food supply. This is what systemic replacement looks like from the household level. Not a better product on the shelf, but the problem quietly solved somewhere else, in the supply chain, in the milk that was already being delivered, and the remedy becoming a relic of a nutritional landscape that no longer fully existed.
4. Whiskey for teething, colds, and fever. The medicinal use of whiskey in American households was not casual. It was categorized. A small amount rubbed on an infant's gums for teething, a hot toddy for a feverish adult, a measure mixed with honey and lemon for a chest cold. Each application specific, each dose considered. The formal record of prohibition clarifies something that might otherwise seem like a comfortable myth. Between 1920 and 1933, physicians in the United States were legally permitted to prescribe whiskey for medicinal purposes. An estimated 11 million such prescriptions were issued during that period. The distilleries that remained in operation during Prohibition did so under license precisely because the federal government recognized whiskey as a medicine. The question was never whether it worked for certain purposes. The question was who was allowed to dispense it and under what authority. St. Joseph's aspirin for children arrived in 1947 as the first widely marketed pharmaceutical alternative for children's fever and pain. It held that position for more than 3 decades. Then, in studies published between 1980 and 1982, researchers established a connection between aspirin use in children with viral illness and Ray's syndrome, a rare but serious condition causing liver and brain damage. The CDC issued warnings in 1982. The FDA required label warnings by 1986. Aspirin's position in children's medicine collapsed almost immediately. The market opening went to acetaminophen. Tylenol became the dominant children's fever reducer within a few years of the Ray's warnings. The sequence, whiskey, replaced by aspirin as the safe modern option, aspirin, restricted in children because of its own risks, Tylenol, positioned as the safe modern replacement for the now restricted safe modern replacement. At each stage, the previous treatment was framed as the problem. The whiskey at the beginning of that chain was never formally studied. It was simply assumed to be where the danger started. Cold compresses and vinegar wraps for fever. Before pharmaceutical fever management, there was physical fever management. Cold water compresses, wet sheet wraps. In some households, diluted vinegar rubs applied to the skin. all of it documented in nursing manuals and household guides of the early 20th century. These methods required time. They required someone to stay, to monitor, to re-wet the cloth, to watch the fever, to judge when it was breaking and when it wasn't. Fever management before aspirin was labor-intensive in a specific way. It demanded sustained human attention as the clinical tool. Pharmaceutical fever management is faster. It requires less presence. A measured dose, a glass of water, and you can leave the room. The clinical outcome, in most cases of uncomplicated fever, is not substantially different. What changed in that transaction, and what no clinical study of the transition measured, was the role of sustained human attention in care. The compress required someone to stay. The tablet does not. Whether anything is lost in that difference is not a pharmacological question, but it is a question about what care actually consists of, and the transition happened too quickly and too quietly for anyone to formally ask it.
Sulfur and molasses spring tonic. Each spring in households across Appalachia and the rural South, children received a mixture of powdered sulfur and blackstrap molasses, given by the spoonful, not reluctantly, with conviction. The winter had depleted something, and the tonic restored it. The specific mechanism was never articulated in clinical terms, because clinical terms were not the framework these households used. The framework was seasonal. The body had rhythms. The tonic honored them. This practice is documented primarily through oral history and regional cultural records, rather than formal medical literature, which is itself part of the story. The practices that existed outside institutions were also largely invisible to the institutional record. They survived in memory rather than in archives. Miles Laboratories introduced one-a-day vitamins in 1943. The timing is worth sitting with. The commercial vitamin tablet and the sulfur and molasses tonic are answering the same question, that the body needs something extra, something the ordinary diet may not be supplying, something that arrives in a specific form at a specific time. One of them was developed in a laboratory and sold at a pharmacy. One was prepared in a kitchen and passed down without a brand name. The one-a-day vitamin still exists. The spring tonic largely does not. The question of which one was more effective for the specific nutritional needs of the specific communities that used them was never formally studied. The question of which one was more profitable was answered quickly. Homemade cough syrup. The recipe appears in household guides, church cookbooks, and handwritten remedy collections across several decades. Honey, lemon juice, whiskey, sometimes a raw onion left to steep overnight, and the resulting liquid strained and spooned to a coughing child. The proportions vary, the ingredients don't. Robitussin arrived in 1951, Vicks Formula 44 in 1964. Both were marketed as scientifically formulated improvements on whatever the family had been doing before. The active ingredient in most commercial cough suppressants of the period was dextromorphine, a synthetic compound developed from morphine analogs that suppresses the cough reflex. In 2007, a research team at Penn State published a study comparing honey, dextromorphine, and no treatment for nighttime cough in children. Honey outperformed dextromorphine, not marginally, measurably, across multiple outcome measures. The commercial cough syrup did not replace the home remedy because it worked better. It replaced the home remedy because it was cheaper relative to household income by the mid-1950s, required no preparation, and carried the authority of a label with a pharmaceutical company's name on it. The 2007 study did not restore honey to its former position. By 2007, the cultural infrastructure that had made the home remedy normal, the knowledge, the habit, the generational transmission of the recipe, had gone for 40 years. Validating the remedy after the practice disappeared is not the same
as having the practice. 8. Boric acid eyewash. Boric acid solution was in the household guide and on the pharmacy shelf through the mid-20th century, a mild antiseptic used for eye irritation and minor wound washing, available without a prescription, inexpensive and widely trusted. It was not a fringe remedy, it was standard. Its displacement came without a formal prohibition. Antibiotic eye drops became available after World War II and gradually took over the clinical role boric acid had occupied. Sterile saline eventually replaced it for simple eye irrigation. Medical guidance shifted away from it, quietly and without announcement. Boric acid is still commercially available today. It was never banned. What happened to it is more instructive than a ban. It stopped being recommended by physicians, which meant it stopped being mentioned to patients, which meant it stopped being purchased by households, which meant it stopped being stocked prominently by pharmacies, which meant the knowledge of how and when to use it correctly dissolved through a series of economic and institutional decisions that no one made explicitly. The remedy didn't lose a fight, it lost a supply chain. 9. Tincture of iodine. The sting was the point. Tincture of iodine, iodine dissolved in alcohol, was the standard wound antiseptic from the late 19th century through World War II and beyond. It stained the skin brown-orange. It burned on application. Both of those things were, in the understanding of the households that used it, features. The sting confirmed that something active was happening. The staining showed where the antiseptic had reached. Betadine, povidone iodine, a gentler formulation with less sting and less staining, arrived in 1955. Neosporin had already come in 1951. Between them, tincture of iodine lost its position in the household medicine cabinet over the following 2 decades, not because its antiseptic properties had failed, but because the products that replaced it were more comfortable and more pleasant. Whether comfort and pleasantness are appropriate criteria for evaluating wound antisepsis is a clinical question that was largely not asked during the transition. The products that won the household did so partly on user experience. The iodine that lost had been confirmed effective in field medicine through 2 world wars. Those 2 facts are not in contradiction, but they are also not the same thing as equivalence.
10. Mercurochrome and merthiolate. This is the one that most viewers will not know. Merbromin, sold as mercurochrome, was introduced in 1918. For roughly 6 decades, it was one of the most common items in the American medicine cabinet. The red-orange antiseptic painted on cuts, scrapes, and childhood injuries of every description. 3 generations of Americans grew up with it applied to their wounds. Its color was so familiar, it became a kind of cultural shorthand for antiseptic treatment itself. In 1998, the FDA classified mercurochrome as not generally recognized as safe and effectively removed it from over-the-counter sale in the United States. The 1998 action did not generate headlines proportional to how long the product had been in use or how universally it had been trusted. A substance introduced in 1918, present in virtually every American medicine cabinet through the 1970s, was quietly reclassified 80 years after its introduction. The determination that it could not be confirmed safe was made after 8 decades of household application. Merthiolate, thimerosal, a related mercury-based antiseptic, took a different trajectory. Its dual history as a household antiseptic and vaccine preservative made it the center of significant public controversy beginning in the 1990s. The household product and the vaccine additive were the same compound. Most American households had painted it on their children's knees for decades before anyone made that connection publicly. The product that had already replaced both of them, Neosporin, introduced in 1951, later generated its own concern. Research suggesting that routine use of antibiotic ointments on minor wounds may contribute to antibiotic-resistant bacteria. The replacement of the replacement was found to carry its own costs. This is the pattern, not the exception. 11. Camphorated oil. Camphorated oil, 20% camphor dissolved in cottonseed oil, occupied the chest remedy position in American households through the mid-20th century. Applied externally to the chest and throat for congestion and cough. Used on sore muscles. In some documented cases, administered in small internal doses as well. Camphor is toxic in significant concentrations. The medical literature of the period contains documented cases of camphor poisoning. The compound is not hypothetically dangerous. Its toxicity at high doses is established. In 1980, the FDA restricted the high-concentration product from consumer sale. Camphorated oil at household strength was effectively removed from the market. Vicks VapoRub remained on the market. It contains approximately 4.8% camphor. It carries a specific warning against internal use. It sits in pharmacy aisles today, widely trusted, purchased without a second thought. The active compound in the product that was removed and the active compound in the product that survived are the same. The difference is concentration and the set of instructions printed on the label. What the FDA determined in 1980 was not that camphor was dangerous, the product that contains it is still available, but that the concentration that had been in American medicine cabinets for decades was a concentration that American households could no longer be trusted to manage on their own. That determination was made, as with mercurochrome, decades after the product had been in common household use.
12. Kerosene for head lice. Kerosene, coal oil, applied to the hair and scalp was a documented home treatment for head lice through the mid-20th century. It appears in public health literature and nursing education materials of the period, not as a fringe practice, but as a known and common household response to an extremely common problem. It was flammable. It was harsh on the scalp. It worked. Lindane shampoo, sold under the brand name Quell, became the standard pharmaceutical lice treatment in the 1950s. It was presented as the modern, safe, medically supervised alternative to what households had been doing with kerosene. The medical community endorsed it. Physicians prescribed it. Schools recommended it. In 2003, the FDA placed a black box warning on Lindane products. The warning cited risk of neurotoxicity, particularly in children, people with low body weight, the elderly, and anyone with a skin condition that might increase absorption. The same children's lice treatment that had been prescribed as the safe alternative to kerosene carried 50 years later the FDA's most serious warning category. Permethrin-based treatments had received FDA approval in 1986. They became the new standard. The treatment for lice went from one flammable and hazardous substance to a regulated pharmaceutical, to a black-boxed pharmaceutical, to a newer alternative in roughly 50 years. At each transition, the previous treatment was identified as the dangerous one. At each transition, that identification was accurate. At no transition was the identification complete. 13. Turpentine. Turpentine as internal medicine is now so far outside the frame of acceptable medical practice that the distance between here and there requires a moment to measure. In 19th and early 20th century household guides and medical literature, small doses of turpentine, mixed with sugar or with castor oil, appear as a treatment for intestinal parasites, an anthelminthic. Used in rural communities, documented particularly in Appalachian and Southern contexts, where hookworm, pinworm, and roundworm infections were common enough to require a household-level response. The external use of turpentine in liniments for joint pain and muscle soreness is more widely documented and remained in practice somewhat longer. The internal use had largely declined in urban households by the 1930s, but persisted in rural communities into the 1940s, based on the available oral and cultural record. Piperazine became the standard pharmaceutical anthelminthic in the 1950s. Mebendazole, Vermox, received FDA approval in 1974. What turpentine as internal medicine illustrates more starkly than almost anything else on this list is how completely the definition of medicine was redrawn across the 20th century. The people who used it were not reckless. They were using what was available in communities where the physician was days away and the pharmacy was further. The compound that is obviously and entirely outside medicine today was, within living memory, a documented household response to a documented medical problem. The distance between those two sentences is not entirely explained by pharmacology. It is also explained by infrastructure, access, and the institutional authority to define what medicine is allowed to be. 14. Clove oil for toothache. Eugenol, the active compound in clove oil, has documented analgesic and antiseptic properties. This was not folk belief subsequently disproved. This was folk practice subsequently confirmed. Applied directly to the affected tooth or surrounding gum, clove oil was the standard home treatment for toothache through the mid-20th century. The relief was real, the mechanism is understood, and the compound is effective. When the pharmacological research caught up with the household practice, it agreed. Which is why eugenol is still used in professional dental practice today. It remains an active ingredient in some dental cements and temporary fillings, the same compound applied to the same tissue for the same purpose by someone with a dental degree instead of a kitchen spice rack. What replaced it at the consumer level was benzocaine, the active ingredient in Oragel, which entered commercial sale in the late 1960s, a synthetic local anesthetic delivering faster numbing action, but without the antimicrobial properties eugenol carried. The home remedy and the professional tool are doing related but not identical work with different compounds. The consumer was given the faster version, the dentist kept the older one. The chemistry was never the problem. The problem was who was allowed to dispense which chemistry and under what circumstances. 15. Epsom salts. Magnesium sulfate, Epsom salts, dissolved in water and drunk as a laxative, was a documented household remedy through the mid-20th century. It appears in household medical guides without apology or qualification. It was medicine. Specifically, it was a saline laxative. The magnesium draws water into the intestine, accelerating transit. The mechanism is straightforward, and the effect is real. Its internal use declined through the post-war period as the commercial laxative market expanded, and gentler alternatives became both cheaper and more convenient. No formal prohibition, no regulatory action, a gradual shift in recommendation and then in habit. Epsom salts are now sold almost exclusively as a bath soak. The magnesium sulfate in the bath product and the magnesium sulfate in the household remedy are chemically identical. What changed is the category, the cultural and commercial designation of what the product is for and who it is for. The movement from medicine to wellness is worth noticing because it runs in a specific direction. Medicine requires evidence of efficacy, regulatory approval, and institutional endorsement. Wellness requires none of those things. Epsom salts moved from the first category to the second, not because they were disproved, but because the second category became commercially available as a destination. The product didn't lose its medical past. It was repositioned away from it.
16. Quinine water for fever and malaria. Malaria was still present in parts of the American South in the 1940s. That fact is essential context for everything that follows. Quinine, extracted from the bark of the cinchona tree, had been the standard treatment for malaria for centuries. In malaria-endemic regions of the American South, tonic water containing quinine was consumed as a prophylactic. The gin and tonic that became a cocktail
had, in an earlier form and a different context, been genuine medicine. The Centers for Disease Control was founded in 1946. Its original and specific mandate was the control of malaria in the United States. That mandate was not ceremonial. The disease it was created to combat was real and present. During WW2, Japanese occupation of Southeast Asia cut off American access to cinchona bark. The military substituted atabrine, quinacridone, as its primary anti-malarial. Soldiers took it under orders. It turned their skin yellow and was intensely unpopular. After the war, chloroquine became the standard civilian anti-malarial, and quinine's clinical position was largely displaced. In 2006, the FDA reclassified quinine as a prescription-only medication, citing cardiac risks associated with its use, specifically the risk of a dangerous heart rhythm abnormality. The tonic water sold in every grocery store still contains quinine, but at a concentration too low for therapeutic effect. The cocktail mixer retained the name and the slight bitterness. The medicine in it became something you now need a physician to access. 17. Garlic and onion poultices. Garlic contains allicin. Allicin has documented antimicrobial properties in laboratory settings, confirmed, not disputed, not estimated. The chemistry behind the garlic poultice applied to a congested chest is not imaginary. Whether allicin delivered through a cloth poultice at room temperature to the external chest wall reached concentrations sufficient to affect bacterial infection in the lungs is a different question entirely, one that was never formally studied, because by the time the research tools existed to study it, penicillin had already made the question appear unnecessary. The garlic and onion poultice was a documented practice in immigrant communities and rural households through the mid-20th century, present in oral histories, regional household guides, and the remembered practices of families from Southern and Eastern European backgrounds in particular. It carried cultural weight alongside whatever pharmacological effect it may have had. The application of the poultice was care, sustained, physical, present. Mass civilian availability of penicillin after 1945 was the displacement force, not a study that disproved the poultice, an antibiotic that made bacterial pneumonia a different kind of problem, one with a clear pharmaceutical resolution. The garlic remedy was abandoned before it was evaluated. Whether the abandonment was correct cannot now be determined because the evaluation was never made.
18. Raw onion and tobacco poultice for stings and bites. A raw onion half pressed to a bee sting. Chewed or dampened tobacco applied to a wasp sting or insect bite. Both documented in oral histories, regional household guides, and folk medicine records across multiple American communities through the mid-20th century. There is no clinical study of whether raw onion is effective on bee stings. There was never going to be one. The practices that lived entirely in oral tradition required no purchased ingredient, crossed no regulatory threshold, and existed entirely outside the commercial pharmaceutical system, were invisible to the research infrastructure that determined what medicine was. They could not be patented. They could not be marketed. They generated no revenue. They therefore generated no studies. Benadryl, diphenhydramine, arrived in 1946 as the first widely available antihistamine. Hydrocortisone cream became available over the counter in 1979. Both addressed the histamine response to stings and bites with documented pharmacological mechanisms. What replaced the onion and tobacco was not better evidence. Better evidence was not available because the evidence for the alternatives was itself limited at the household level. What replaced them was commercial availability, pharmacological framing, and the cultural authority of a product with a mechanism of action printed on its label. The practices that couldn't be put on a label were the practices that disappeared, not because they were disproven, but because disproving them was never the point. Replacing them was. 19. pennyroyal, and herbal reproductive remedies. The language in the household guides and women's networks of the 19th and early 20th century is careful and consistent. Language to bring on a late period, to restore regularity, to address what was described as a menstrual obstruction. The terminology is euphemistic in a way that is itself informative. It describes a category of knowledge that existed adjacent to formal medicine, in the spaces between what could be said openly and what needed to be communicated woman to woman without documentation. Pennyroyal, tansy, blue cohosh. These herbs and others appear in household guides, in letters, in the records of midwives and lay healers. Their use as menstrual regulators and, in some cases, abortifacients is documented by historians of women's health with considerable scholarly rigor. This is not a marginal or disputed history. It is a well-researched one that received less general attention than it warranted. The tradition existed specifically in the spaces where formal medical access was unavailable, unaffordable, or, depending on the period and the jurisdiction, legally hostile. It did not require a physician. It did not require a prescription. It did not require money beyond what the household garden or a local herbalist could provide. Enovid, the first oral contraceptive pill, received FDA approval in 1960. Griswold versus Connecticut established in 1965 the right of married couples to use contraception. Eisenstadt versus Baird extended that right to unmarried individuals in 1972. The pill did not simply replace the herbal tradition. It existed in a different access structure. The pill required a prescription, a physician, and eventually insurance. The herbal tradition had required none of those things, which was precisely why the women who relied on it used it. What was lost when the tradition declined was not just a remedy, it was a form of access that had existed outside institutional medicine, specifically because institutional medicine had not been available to everyone who needed it. The expansion of formal reproductive health care reached many of those communities. It did not reach all of them equally. The gap that the herbal tradition had occupied did not disappear when the tradition did.
Conditions, it still works. The medicine cabinet of 1932 was not emptied by accident. It was emptied by a combination of forces that operated simultaneously and largely without coordination. Commercial products that were easier and cheaper and better marketed, regulatory actions that redrew the line between household medicine and controlled substance, and systemic interventions that solved the underlying problems upstream, in the milk supply, in the water, in the industrial food system, so that the remedies became relics of diseases that had been rerouted rather than cured. Some of what left deserved to go. Turpentine as internal medicine, kerosene on children's scalps, high-concentration camphorated oil in households without clear dosage guidance. The regulatory actions that removed these things were, in most cases, grounded in real evidence of real harm. Some of what left was taken before the question of whether it should go was ever seriously asked. The garlic poultice was abandoned before allicin was studied. The homemade cough syrup was replaced by a product that a 2007 study would find less effective. The herbal reproductive tradition declined in communities that still needed the access it had provided. And one thing came back, formally evaluated, federally approved, doing exactly what it had always done. The lesson of the leech is not that folk medicine was right all along. It is that the evaluation matters, that the question of what works, for whom, under what conditions, asked honestly and with appropriate rigor, sometimes produces an answer that nobody expected. The 19 remedies that did not come back were mostly never given the chance to fail that test on their own terms. They were replaced before the test was administered. What was in that medicine cabinet in 1932 represented accumulated knowledge, imperfect, sometimes dangerous, unevenly distributed, and entirely without institutional authority. What replaced it was more standardized, more studied in certain respects,
more regulated, and attached to an economic system with a strong interest in what got replaced and what did the replacing. Both of those things can be true at once. Holding them both is what the history of everyday medicine actually requires. If you want to see more of what the standard account of American history leaves out, the systems, the products, the decisions that shaped ordinary life and were never properly explained, the next video is waiting.